Welcome to our December's webinar. As I said before I press the record button, you're really in for a treat. Today we're exploring spatial reasoning and land use planning. This presentation is brought to us by Amy Wilson, who's the founder and principal consultant for Social, Economic, Energy, and Resource Renewal, LLC, based out of Albuquerque, I believe. And we have a good presentation. As usual, I want to go over a few ground rules, and then I'll hand it over to Amy to begin her presentation. This is recorded. We'll always record our webinars unless I have some kind of technical error and I didn't press the button correctly. It'll always be done, and this is certainly no exception. Because the information presented in this webinar is fairly comprehensive and sometimes dense, I do encourage everyone to share the presentation after we post it on our Foundation's Vimeo account, to share that with colleagues and to watch it again to better understand some of the concepts that Amy will bring up today. It is thorough. You will walk away with good information about some of the pieces you're going to need to better understand how to do jobs in land planning and land use concerns. So certainly as we begin this conversation this morning, keep in mind that some of these pieces, so that way you could better apply it to your own positions or those of your departments. If you have any questions or comments, I encourage you to use the chat feature like I always do. However, you could also raise your hand. Now, whichever method you prefer to go on, I recommend have a little patience with me, because I will see them, and then I will let Amy know before your question is either asked or you're able to speak directly with her. In other words, though, sit back, relax, enjoy the session that we're about to partake in. One more piece, the January webinar will be on January 19th. I will put in the chat feature the registration link so that you can get in early or share it with other people. And then this topic will be about how to execute a plan, staying on budget in the planning process without compromising your goals or vision. So we're extending our planning conversation into the new year and starting off pretty good while we end pretty good. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Amy to begin our presentation. Amy.
Hi, everyone. Let me share my screen if I can do that. Let's see. Sorry. Bear with me here. Can you all see that? Okay, perfect. So thank you, Nichlas, for introducing myself and the presentation. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I do appreciate it. I know that we're nearing the holidays and everyone has a lot going on. So I appreciate you taking the time. And I also just want to thank the Indian Land Tenure Foundation also for inviting me to be here. So again, my name is Amy Wilson, and I'm out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm the founder and principal of Renewal. And I was invited here today to prepare this webinar to provide information, just some information about what I know about land planning in Indian country. So this is a topic that I'm well studied on. I've both in academia and practice. I have advanced degrees in land use planning and economic development and energy. I've been working in the field for 12 years. 7 of those years, the last 7 years, I've spent exclusively working in Indian country. So I'm really excited. I have a lot of material to cover, so I'll get started. This is us. This is our roadmap for today. Today's presentation starts out with conceptual ideas, and then it moves into the technical side, or the boots on the ground planning components. So to achieve this, I'm first going to introduce you to the concept of spatial reasoning, and then I'm going to lay out, sorry, I need to minimize that. I'm going to lay out what we know about land management issues based on the research available to us. So next, I'm going to briefly cover forces. And what I mean by forces, I mean political, economic, societal, and natural forces that we deal with as individuals, communities, and political bodies. And then I'm going to discuss how those influence tribal land management. So then I'll get into the different approaches to planning, the planning process itself. We'll look at rational planning and participatory planning. And then I'm going to take you through the actual steps of the planning process. We're going to look at the elements of a land use plan. And then I'll also discuss implementation and adoption of that plan. So, all right, here we go. So I just want to first discuss this concept of spatial reasoning with you. Spatial reasoning is the ability to reason and remember the spatial relations among objects or space. So in this context, it's the ability to understand and remember the relationship between people, places, and things, or in other words, the relationship between land, economy, culture, and law. So this is important to land use planning, because land use planning is about assessing the land, setting an intention for land use in the form of a plan and a spatial map. Then we implement these plans based on programs and policies that eventually will shape the lands within that jurisdiction. So in essence, our land management decisions really play out visually. So it's important to be cognizant of these relationships that we have both as individuals and groups with the land. And that means legal relationships, but also customary relationships. I mean, those traditional lands and relationships to those. So I first want to get into what we know about territorial land management issues. I've developed the framework for this presentation based on these concepts. This is developed through literature review and studies conducted under a range of fields. I've also referenced research performed under the Swiss Research Institute. But political bodies all over the world really struggle with a wide range of challenges related to land tenure, including resource market, access to market, or resource quality, access to market, and then the factors that, these other factors that just put pressure on land managers. So although land management issues are highly nuanced and localized, we have a lot of research available to us that helps us to provide a framework for understanding the different factors at play. So according to the studies that we have available to us, we know that land management issues arise from this changing landscape. A changing landscape refers to changing physical and natural conditions. And then that really results from extraction and urbanization processes, or what's referred to in economics as the factors of production. So based on a large body of research, we're clear on those factors, and we're clear that those factors change the landscape, and those factors include political, economic, social, and natural. We also know that when those factors combine, that they create this force that then influences that production or extraction and those processes at a faster rate. So because of the research tools that we have available to us, we can track that. We know that we understand this relationship between these regulatory components, between consumers, the movement of goods and services. And then last, we know that national policy, or in this case, tribal policy, territorial policy, when reinforced by regional and local policy causes this observed transformation and causes this observed transformation. So transformation meaning these long-term changes that are shaped by these forces. So what do we know about the changing landscape? We know that the formulation and the implementation of public policies, programs, and projects for the development of a territory gives that government greater control in shaping and benefiting from the extraction and urbanization processes that are occurring within that jurisdiction. We also know that the intentions that are set out in these plans and policy are largely sustained by the government that they're developed under, so that they're charged with carrying it out. But we know that these external conditions, these external forces can either reinforce or threaten those plans and policies in this case at the tribal level. So because territorial governments are this happens because governments are entrenched in each other. They're highly embedded in these political, legal, and economic and cultural contexts. So this research that I've just reviewed focuses on territorial governments. You heard me mention territorial governments a few times over the last couple of slides. So in the context of the United States, a territorial government means any subset or political jurisdiction under the sovereign jurisdiction of the United States. So what does this mean for you as a tribal nation? You have a government-to-government relationship with the United States. You're not a state, you're not a local jurisdiction. You have this unique relationship. So why does this concept really matter? It matters because you're still embedded or entrenched in these nesting political systems. As a sovereign nation, you're still situated within a region, you're situated within a state, within a territory. And what those actors are doing at the regional and national and local levels outside of your jurisdiction undoubtedly impact your tribal land management activities that are going on within your nation. This is a highly complicated relationship under any condition, but as a tribal nation and as a sovereign, it's even more complicated. So when you're engaged in tribal land management and land planning and zoning especially, it's really important to be cognizant of all of these players. Okay, so in respect to force, what do I mean, or forces? In physics, force is described as a push or a pull on an object. It can influence that this push or pull influences or causes change in the motion or the direction of another object with mass. So this presentation isn't about physics, thankfully for you, because I'm bad at physics, but the premise is the same. For the purpose of today's discussion, force involves this authority and the power of institutions and groups and individuals to influence change in law and policy. So to really influence change in business and social morals and values. In this context, force also refers to the natural processes that we experience from weather events. But when when these factors work in combination with other factors, they form this relationship that then becomes that force. So just like in physics, the force here is the result of one object or one factor's interaction with another. So I just want to briefly talk about non-tribal government because I feel it's important when you're discussing tribal land management. I hit on this a little bit, but I think it's important to hit on it a little bit deeper. And I know it's not always popular to discuss when you're discussing tribal land management because you are a sovereign, but it is important because you are embedded with these other jurisdictions in some way. So federal, state, local, and government local government and the individuals and groups and institutions under those jurisdictions create this multitude of forces that can either, again, reinforce your intentions, your plans, and your policies, or they can work against you. So as tribal land managers, it's critical to know what's going on at all of these levels, because again, you're embedded, you're entrenched in these. Yes, you are a sovereign, but these are interconnected economies, interconnected societies, interconnected natural resources that cannot be contained by borders. So in order for you to conserve and use your lands the way that you want to, that one, aligns with your beliefs, your traditions, your culture, and your values, and then two, makes the most productive use of human, financial, technological, and natural resources, it's really vital to pay attention to all of these forces. It's also important to remember that the federal government has obligations and authorities that are unique. Tribal nation has these authorities that are unique. The tribal government, they manage Indian lands, but they also manage non-Indian lands and resources that are contiguous to Indian lands. So for instance, roughly 31 tribes have lands that are contiguous to lands managed under the United States Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. So yeah, that's a small number of tribes, but no doubt do those decisions that are being made at the US Forest Service and the BLM affect those 31 tribes, because those harbor really valuable resources. So it's important to think about those that are involved in managing Indian lands, such as the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but also the other folks when you're engaging in land management in your own jurisdiction. So, just thinking about the United States Department of Transportation, I mean, their programs affect you. And then at the state level, you have these, incredibly strong regional councils of governments that play this fundamental role in regional economies, including regional transportation networks and also water and other infrastructure systems. These are incredible, again, they're incredibly powerful, and a lot of the funding is channeled through these regional councils of government. So as a tribal government, it's critical to be aware of these folks and to leverage that as much as possible. And then at the local level, these are your neighbors. Their policy making, their economies, societies, and natural resources will no doubt affect your land management activities. And then the same goes for them. I mean, what you do affects those outside of your border as well. So the point here is just really to encourage you to think about these critical forces, think about them in your land management, and most certainly in your planning and zoning. Okay, so a tribe's authority to plan and zone is derived from Indian law, United States Constitution, case law, and then the tribal law itself, tribal constitution. I'll get into this more later, but tribes manage and regulate lands as an aspect of sovereignty based on the Indian land tenure system. The tribal government may enact management codes and policies that exert those inherent rights to use, manage, and regulate lands as they see fit. So authorities include to enforce ownership rights, to exclude people from Indian lands, zone trust lands or lands within the reservation, and then also to control the allocation of trust lands and determine how those lands are used. So the courts have found that tribal government cannot zone fee lands within the reservation. However, the courts have also found that tribes can plan and zone for all of the lands and resources within their exterior boundary to preserve the character of the land and to promote economic growth and human safety and to preserve resources. So there's, this weird kind of gray area, but that shouldn't keep you from engaging in these activities in order to protect your lands the way that you want to. Okay, so now we're gonna move into the next part of the presentation. Here I'll be introducing what land use and planning, what land use planning and zoning is as a political tool. using this, you have greater control over lands, and you're able to minimize land management issues. So a land use plan is developed pursuant to tribal law, and it's used to manage and regulate the development of lands within the exterior boundaries of the reservation. So land use plans are also known as a comprehensive land use plan or a master plan. Land use plans are distinct from other plans that may include land use elements, such as a comprehensive economic development strategy plan, or some of you might be more familiar with this as a SUDS plan. But the distinction is between the formal land use plan and those with land use elements, such as the SUDS plan, that the land use plan includes a future land use map or a depiction of future land uses that have been planned out for the community and adopted pursuant to tribal law. So this means that land use plans are a political tool to shape and control how development occurs within a jurisdiction through policy. Zoning is considered a land control. It's a regulatory tool that you use to ensure that activities, uses, and development occur with some predetermined standard. So a quick note to point out regarding that first bullet, in respect to central government, this can mean either the tribal governing body itself or some delegated authority of the tribe who's been charged under tribal law to act on behalf of the tribal governing body to manage and regulate the lands within that jurisdiction. So for those of you who work for tribal governments where villages or bands have some semi-autonomous authority to either plan and zone or plan pursuant to tribal law, this would refer to you folks. Another example of this would be in instances where the tribal code delegates some planning and regulatory authorities to some department, whether it be a planning department or an environmental department, where that department is charged by the governing body to carry out the rules under the land use plan carry out the rules under the land use code, or even like a planning committee. So in respect to what lands may be included in a land use plan and zoning code, as a tribe, again, you have the authority to develop land use plans however you want, as long as you're following your own rules. So a standard approach to this would be to define the entire reservation as the planning area. So your entire, with your boundaries of your reservation as the planning area. And then depending on your land tenure system, your tribal laws and the purpose for the plan, you may want to have separate plans. So for those, villages or bands, or you might want to have a sub-area plan for specific areas of development that you're interested in. So for instance, some of you have this larger land base, but you don't really have a need to plan and zone for the entire reservation. So an alternative would be to still define your political jurisdiction as the planning area. And by doing this, you're really exerting their authority over those lands and resources. You're stating your general vision for them. But then you can formulate specific intentions and policies, even zoning, for certain areas of your reservation. So when you're doing this, you're able to manage the lands and control the lands that you want, without having, again, to zone your entire reservation or create kind of detailed policy for the entire reservation. When you're doing this, you really need to make sure that you reference existing plans and authorities that cover the lands and resources within that area. So not just tribal plans, you need to look at regional plans, you need to look at federal, BIA, like forestry management plans, but also the United States Forest Service plans, BLM lands. Make sure that you know what's in there, and that where there's, number one, it'll make you aware so you can have that communication with those external people when you need to, but also just to be aware of, what infrastructure and resources are available that might help you to manage your lands better. So there's different types or styles of comprehensive plans. A land use plan typically has a 10 to 20 year planning horizon, or what's referred to as the planning period. So traditional land use plans emphasize physical development. They include this official land use map. This usually includes action strategies and policies. Traditional plans also usually have an end strategy or a map depiction of where the community is going to be after that planning period. A comprehensive classification plan is similar in that it has those, it emphasizes physical development, but it's more of a, it includes more of a general map or a general growth policy rather than something that would produce, rather than policy that would produce these detailed land patterns such as zoning. So thinking about the previous slide, your plan could very well be a hybrid of both of these, where one or more areas of your reservation has a detailed land policy that's depicted through either a zoning map or some future land use map. And then, that would be embedded in that larger plan that would have this of the reservation that would have that general growth policy. So again, remember, as a tribal government, you're making these laws, so you don't have to follow some pre-described formula, as long as you're following your own code. Now, some codes will say, will outline the elements that must be included in a plan. It's that's really common when you're working at the state level. The state statute will have these elements that you have, as a local jurisdiction, you have to follow. But as a tribe, you don't have to do that. But whoever is developing your plan, if your code, outlines those elements, then it needs to have it in there. So in my experience, tribal codes are kind of all over the place on this. So it's important, that you pay attention to that. But now, should you have a land use plan provision in your code that either you didn't know was there or you've never really followed it, that's okay too. The plan making process is, the time to look at the codes and the time to either decide to make your plan conform to it, or perhaps the governing body wants to, revisit that code and figure out which elements maybe should be modified in order to make it work better for their tribe. So, either way, the point is just to take time. This is, the planning process is the time to look at that code. That should be one of the very first things that you do. Okay, so alternatives to comprehensive planning include what's called policy planning and also what's known as free market land use. So policy planning is where a central governing authority adopts and enforces land use policy, such as zoning, but they lack a supporting plan. So this typically produces patterns of development that are consistent. It minimizes nuisance or minimizes conflicts in land use, but it doesn't necessarily promote the highest and best use of land. So it doesn't necessarily promote this idea of economic development. So the general thought is that without a plan, zoning is mostly piecemeal. Now, another alternative to planning is just, and policy is just no planning and no policy. And that we refer to that as what's called free market land use. So free market land use occurs when land is really not regulated or very minimally regulated by the central governing authority. And land use decisions are left primarily to the individuals and the groups that are using the lands. So an example of this in Indian country would be where tribal government approves a home site or a business site or other lease without real consideration of a land use plan or a zoning ordinance. So even if you have traditional, your land tenure system is set up on a traditional system, it's still valuable to have these in place to really, guide that development. So one thing I also want to point out that free market land use can also occur even if you have a comprehensive land use plan and zoning code in place. If you have these in place, but you're not implementing them or enforcing them, in effect, you really have a system that reflects this free market land use concept. So zoning is a regulatory tool that we use to directly and immediately implement collective decisions about community land uses. So zoning is used for permitting, prohibiting, limiting, and restricting development of land within specified zones. So the purpose of zoning is really to achieve this desired land pattern that is effectively served by public facilities and infrastructure such as transportation. Zoning regulations are found both in the text of your code, and then they're depicted on the map, and then they're found in the corresponding land use plan. So these are three things that all go together. A zoning district refers to a section of the reservation where zoning regulations and standards are uniform, meaning the regulations and the standards apply equally to everyone within those jurisdictions. Zoning districts are a way to ensure that everyone within a district conform to the use and intensity regulations that are set for that zone. So again, this purpose is to set these desirable land use patterns that minimize conflicting land use, really promote safety and also conservation and economic development. So there's a variety of types of zoning districts. This illustration here shows what we refer to kind of as traditional zoning. This form of zoning is known specifically by name as Euclidean zoning. It was named after the first significant zoning case in American law. The Village of Euclid versus Amber Realty Company. In that case, the court held that a local government could restrict how an owner might use certain lands. So essentially, the court said, okay, government, you can intrude on property rights in order to maintain this character of the land. So, you know, the legal precedent that was established in Euclid is not Indian law. So, you know, it doesn't apply, but it still matters to tribes, because even though as a tribe you have the authority to allocate lands and designate lands how you wish without having to worry about, you know, takings issues that you have to worry about outside of Indian country. This is important because this case really kind of set the framework. It developed the concept for this. The intention of it is, you know, by dividing these areas, you're able to preserve and protect the character of your land and use them efficiently and to conserve. So, you know, it still is important to you because it really developed that kind of framework for what we see today as traditional zoning. And it's also important, you know, because as an aspect of sovereignty, meaning, you know, pursuant to Indian law and the US Constitution, case law, and your own tribal law, you have the authority to do this. So, you know, it's essentially an action of exerting authorities and sovereignty. Okay, so zoning regulations include what's referred to as use categories. These categories outline the purpose for which a lot or tract of land, a building or other structure may be designated, arranged, or occupied. So this can include, you know, everything from residential, commercial, industrial to, you know, everything else. In this photo here, you can see that, you know, there's kind of this general layout of the plan of the site that is consistent, has these consistent uses and kind of arrangement of buildings. So intensity refers to the relative measure of development impact that's defined by characteristics such as the number of dwelling units per acre, the amount of traffic that's been generated, and just the general site coverage. So to measure this, we use what's called an intensity system, and we use that based on height and setback regulations, open space regulations, parking and also ingress and egress, so circulation, and then even design standards such as landscaping and hardscaping and lighting. But in this photo here on your screen, you can see that the buildings, most of these buildings have a really large footprint that they look to be industrial or maybe heavy commercial uses. They don't see what looks to be like a small coffee shop or a barber shop in these areas. And again, that's, an example of really, zoning by intensity. So again, to be clear, your use and your intensity regulations will be are elements that are included in the text of the zoning, and then they're depicted through your zoning map. So in addition to Euclidean zoning, we have what's referred to as overlay zones. An overlay zone is a separate zone that's placed on a zoning map over your traditional districts for some special purpose. So really the intention is to protect environmentally sensitive areas, to preserve historic areas, to preserve cultural sites, and then also even to improve economic development or promote it in one area or another. And this could either be through a hub zone or just through a tribal economic development like enterprise zone. And again, overlay regulations are, those will be found in the text and illustrated in the mapping as well. So official land use maps illustrate zoning districts that are outlined in the zoning code, as I've said. So where you have this zoning code, your official zoning map really needs to align with the text of the zoning code. So if you have, residential, commercial, industrial, heavy industrial, light industrial in your zoning, in the text of your zoning code, that should be reflected in your zoning map. I borrowed these maps here from the Metlakatla Indian community of the Islands Reserve in Alaska to give you an idea of a relatively simple but effective land use map. So this map on the left depicts the current land use within the core community area. And then the map on the right illustrates that same core area, but with future land uses. So they've included, everything from residential to commercial, public uses, and even conservation. The light blue on the map is water because they are an island community. So future land use maps are more generalized than those precise delineations that you find in a zoning map. Future land use maps will show these broad categories that indicate, but they can, indicate densities and intensities, but they're more broad and general than your zoning map. So again, I borrowed these maps from Metlakatla. And in this case, you can see that the lands here have these broad areas of development. They're not, they show commercial and conservation and industrial uses, but they're not depicted like they would be in that core map. It's not like zoomed in. In this map, the white is the water, and then the left map is like the north side of the island, and the right map is the south side of the island. And I'll get into Metlakatla later. These are folks that I worked with for a long time now, and I'm using them as a case study and later on in the planning process. And I think a couple of folks are online too from Metlakatla. So hi. So the text of the zoning code includes several provisions, including what's called a general provision. These outline the authorities and the jurisdiction. So under this provision that you'll find, and again, I'm talking about your law and order code is what you're usually referred to in Indian country. So that's what I'm referring to. So in your land use provisions, you'll find, these authorities and the jurisdiction that's outlined in that. And that also will include delegated authorities for carrying out the planning process. So if you have a village or a band that has those delegated authorities, or a tribal department, that'll be included in your code. The text of the zoning code outlines each district by name, including those allowable uses, conditional uses, and intensity measures. So as I pointed out, in the event that and with the overlay zones, in the event that the tribe has an overlay zone, that will also be included in the text of the plan. And it will give, like, for example, if you had a hillside protection or wetlands protection, it's going to restrict uses. Maybe in the wetlands, you can't obviously build a home, but maybe it'll allow for like light, recreation of some sort. Or hillside protection, there's going to be regulations for cut and fills or setbacks. So it'll include regulations on that zoning code. I'm not going to have time to get into the administration and enforcement provision of the code, but this is an incredibly important part. I mean, it's critical to the implementation, the function of your plan and your zoning code. So you really need to have these sound processes in place that include, effective development review processes, that also include, permitting and appeal processes too, for anybody that's looking to do development. So for those of you who may not have a a land use plan in place or zoning in place, but maybe now you're kind of wondering if you should, I've outlined some considerations that you might want to consider. And then for those of you who maybe do have a land use plan and zoning code in place, I'd still ask for you to consider the items that I've outlined and just think about, how well your plan is helping you to address these criteria. So in respect to the first question, how much land is available for use? Land quantity is typically fixed. So I know that there's, opportunities to acquire more land, but for the purposes of land planning, we really think of land as being a fixed resource. So, again, the purpose of the land planning process is to be able to use lands effectively. So to figure out how you can yield the greatest output and benefits that are coming from those lands. And those include social, cultural, economic, environmental benefits. So you want to use the land efficiently. And this is especially true for tribes with a small land base. So, really assessing how much land you have available will be a good indicator of whether planning might be right for you. The second question refers to, is there danger of running out of land? There's many reasons why a political body could be in danger of running out of land. It could just be that you have a small land base that only accommodates a limited number of people, a limited number of enterprises and other land uses. But it could also mean that you have a large land base, but for whatever reason, whether it's topography or, lack of water in one area, or even the ability to connect services to certain areas of the reservation, you're confined to a smaller portion of that reservation for development. So in a sense, in terms of land planning, you are in a way in danger of running out of land. You're in danger of where you can accommodate folks. So the third question is personal to the jurisdiction. Some feel that land should be more controlled and others not so much. But it's important to remember that in general, individuals and groups, they're going to locate where the lands best suit their needs. So, individuals aren't really looking at, they're not thinking about long-term impacts when they're long-term impacts to the environment or the economy, or even capital costs associated with getting services to them, to getting, utilities to them. When individuals and groups are making the decision to locate one place or another. It's based on what suits their needs. So as a government and land managers, this is your job. Your job is to protect trust lands and also, all of the resources within your exterior, the exterior boundaries of your reservation. So you want to make, these land decisions that are in the best interests of your nation. And in order to do that, you really need to pay attention to these immediate and long-term consequences of the decisions that folks, are making. So you can best implement measures and precautions to mitigate any undesirable consequences from where individuals and groups locate. And this, also means paying attention to what other political jurisdictions are doing, because, a lot of times what other political jurisdictions are doing really drives how development happens within your nation. So the takeaway here is really, as a tribal government, you are a sovereign. You have this authority to make these decisions, how to decide where to put people. So, and then also, it's up to you to decide how are you best going to mitigate those unintended consequences. Land use planning and zoning is a way to do that. It's one option in figuring out how to best mitigate those undesirable consequences. So additional criteria to consider when deciding whether or not to use a land use plan and zoning include the management of lands within your nation. Excuse me. Other factors are factors of economic growth. And those factors include land, labor, capital equipment, and entrepreneurship. And if you remember back, to the beginning part of the presentation, those factors are factors of production, and they also reflect or describe extractive and urbanization processes. So if you're a tribe of land, you have each of these four factors, or at least you have the ability to access them. So land planning really allows you to have greater control over the concentrations of labor and industry or production within your nation. And this production is a measurement of economic growth. It's what we use to track economic growth. So by just engaging in these two activities, you're able to understand the concentrations and track them easier and set intentions for what you want to see in the future. So, and most importantly, again, I want to point out that there's funding available, especially now, to help you with these capital costs and infrastructure, even, training programs to bridge areas and knowledge gaps, and programs to incentivize entrepreneurship. So, engaging in planning will help you to be able to find those resources or identify them more easily, and then also to access them. So the last consideration that I've outlined includes what's referred to as urban sprawl. Avoiding sprawl saves money that we invest in infrastructure, and also is used to improve, or avoiding sprawl will help you to avoid a range of conditions, undesirable conditions. Now, I know that most tribes aren't located in urban areas, or what we typically think of urban, such as cities or large communities. But urban also, just simply refers to an area where there's a densely, populated, a location where there's a densely populated area of commercial and residential and other uses, even if this is a small population. So urbanization and sprawl really impacts our social and economic and natural environment. And by implementing planning and land use regulations, you can address these undesirable incidents that really arise from economic or environmental quality, adequacy of water supply, energy consumption. And then one of the biggest kind of components of this is rising costs in rising costs per capita for providing utilities and services. So I want to point out that, today's society really necessitates these urban conveniences for many reasons. But think about broadband for a moment. I know that, even before the pandemic, every tribe I talked to, broadband was like one of the number one things on their list. And now it's even more so for, obvious reasons. But just by, just by having a need for broadband and supplying that signals urbanization. So it really signals the need for land use planning and zoning. Okay, so I've already addressed some of the values associated with planning and land controls, but I want to just take a few minutes to outline accountability, predictable land use patterns, and the planning process itself as valuable components of a plan and a zoning code. So in respect to internal and external accountability, having a plan in place really creates accountability from leadership, from staff, membership, and entrepreneurs. So it helps to mitigate, ad hoc decisions that can impact land and resource values and impact public health and safety. It also helps to create continuity across administrations. So when you have a new administration coming in, they kind of know where the old administration left off. And then, and it doesn't, pigeonhole the new administration into what the old administration wanted, but it creates continuity and it creates predictability for law and everybody else that's involved in planning or locating there. So a land use plan is also valuable to keep the community accountable. So if a member comes to the tribe and they want to develop a home site, but that home site is inconsistent with the land use plan or any land use regulations in place, the governing body then has something to lean on to justify any denied requests. And then one of the greatest benefits of having a land use plan in place, or a land use plan and zoning code in place, is that it is an exercise of sovereignty and authority. So when you use your land use plan and your land use regulations, you're setting this intention for the future, setting intention to conserve and to develop your nation the way that you want. When you're identifying community values and priorities, there's no doubt that federal trust responsibility overlaps with the values and the priorities that you've set. So I've hit on this briefly, but I want to just point out again that as a tribal government, it's important that the tribe use the land use plan to ensure that those benefits and services that are owed to you in exchange for your ceded lands are met. The federal government has this responsibility to respect your sovereignty, to protect the tribe and its membership, and really to protect and enhance lands by supporting self-determination, by supporting economic and social programs to tribes that are needed to improve well-being. So, just by simply stating the intentions that you've set for your nation in this formal and political fashion makes it easier for you as a tribal government to hold the federal government accountable, because again, their role is really supporting you. So additional values include predictability. An adopted and implemented plan promotes a predictable environment. Predictable land use patterns and predictable law is attractive to both developers and funders. Developers want to know that their investment's secure. They want to know that the rules aren't going to change. A plan and a zoning code will help ensure that. Funders also want to see plans. So whether you're seeking a grant or a loan, a land use plan shows that you have this direction set and that the money that you're seeking fits nicely into that direction. You're easily able to justify why you need the funding. And it helps you, this is more, you're more likely to get the funding in this case. So this stands true for the entrepreneurs within your community. You're going to encourage entrepreneurship by having a land use plan and some form of land use control in place. So just like the tribal government, when an entrepreneur seeks funding to either establish a new business or grow an existing business, they can and probably should refer to the land use plan and the zoning code. And then that will help the funder to have greater confidence in knowing, again, that their investment's secure, that the conditions aren't going to change. So, and then the last one I want to hit on is the process itself as being valuable. So when you're going through the planning process, you're collaborating and you're communicating, which bridges gaps in knowledge. You're identifying, you are understanding your environment more at a more detailed level. So considering you're collecting information that allows you to consider this, the environment, you're taking inventory of conditions, which helps you to be more strategic in decision making, and then really invest and support the activities that are going to promote well-being and economic growth. So, again, it just helps you to make more informed decisions, both as land managers and also tribal leaders. So over the next few slides, I'm going to kind of walk you through the different planning techniques that can be deployed to achieve your desired goals. And these include rational planning and participatory planning. So rational planning is this expert-driven technique that's based on a well-established process that's used to prepare comprehensive plans and for community adoption. So this approach really underscores that the policies embodied in the plan must be supported by objective data and analysis. So rational planning includes data collection, includes the analysis of trends. You're carefully, projecting those trends over the period that's covered by the plan. Remember the planning horizon. So all kinds of data can be collected and analyzed when you're engaging in rational planning, but usually the information relating to population and economy is the most important, because that's what will suggest what the community needs over time as conditions change. So methodologies deployed during the rational planning process are really valuable for assessing legal forms of ownership, for analyzing job and industry clusters, and then it helps you to really understand the movement of goods and services to end users. It helps you to track that easier. On the other side, the techniques aren't so good for assessing public perception. It's hard to understand and be able to identify values associated with Aboriginal and customary lands and cultural resources. This linear approach really fails to capture that local knowledge. It fails to look at the interdependency between fact and value judgments, meaning the interdependency between scientific knowledge and local knowledge. So, and it also fails to capture community issues and problems. But that does not mean that rational planning is not necessary and not important for capturing those other items that I've addressed. So participatory planning is kind of a way to fill in the gaps. Participatory planning is a process by which a community undertakes to receive a given, socioeconomic goal, either by consciously, to reach a given socioeconomic goal, and by consciously diagnosing this problem and then charting a course of action to resolve it. So research shows that with the greater stakeholder involvement, with the more people involved in the planning process, that better plans emerge out of that, and the more likely that they are to be implemented. So this has been my experience as well. I mean, I've been doing planning for 12 years, and I feel really strongly about participatory planning. I think that without collaboration and without buy-in, your plan and even your zoning code are not going to be implemented. So I try to incorporate this into my work as much as possible. So participatory planning is good for a range of reasons. It encourages participation from a broad range of stakeholders, including tribal and special population and special interest stakeholders. And then it helps leaders and staff and the community to come to this mutual understanding of problems and solutions. And then it fosters, this kind of supportive and respectful atmosphere through that process where, it's listening, it's engaging, and it's responding, you're responding to each other. So it's good. This process is good because it helps to encourage folks to share responsibility in the solution finding process. They're not just relying on a couple of people. And then it also really encourages shared responsibility in the plan implementation. People have ownership in it. So on the other side, data, the data collected through the participatory planning process is subjective, and that's the point. It's personal to the respondent, so it's not scientific. But the resolution to that is by implementing the appropriate methodologies to interpret that data. So to be diligent in what methodologies you're using to analyze and interpret that personal data. Participatory planning fails to capture this, fails to capture the difference between facts that are associated with social and economic and natural conditions, such as those that we find in demographics and other forms of data. But again, it's resolved through a conscious effort in mixing rational planning and participatory planning techniques. Okay, so the planning process will be, or should be, unique to you. You don't want a cookie cutter process, you don't want a cookie cutter plan, and you don't want a boilerplate zoning code. And the process should be some mixture, again, of rational and participatory planning. This process should always be tribally led, although you're likely going to need some sort of external consultant or expert who's able to bring a lot of various areas of skills and knowledge to the table. They should be understanding of federal law and administrative procedures, Indian law, property law, and land use law. And they should have a good understanding of local and state and regional government. You just really need to make sure that you have someone that can help you understand and identify these forces, but then also be very respectful of what you want. So the formal planning process involves planning out and structuring the planning process. It sounds funny to plan, have to plan, but it is crucial. It's fundamental to the planning process. It guides that process. So additional steps include identifying and collecting and analyzing qualitative and quantitative data, and then also developing a vision and goals and objectives. Then it includes adopting and implementing the plan. The last step is monitoring. Now, I'm not going to have time to get into monitoring the plan today, but it's a crucial component, and by and large, we fail to do it. But it really is important because it helps us to understand the effectiveness of the planning and implementation type efforts that are being made. So, excuse me. Sorry. So the formal planning process uses this standard framework for guiding the planning process. So regardless of the type of plan, it should follow this. It should have a standard framework. Effective and credible plans are informed by local knowledge. And it's also important to remember that, that the ideas or the concepts behind zoning and comprehensive plans weren't really developed or with Indian lands in mind, and and the different governance structures. So be able to know this, and that your plan needs to be unique to you. Yes, it has these fundamental elements. It has you have this fundamental process, but at the end of the day, the plan needs to reflect you. So when I work on planning projects, I like to work with a core planning team or a local planning team that's made up of, tribal staff, leaders, and other stakeholders. And these are the boots on the ground that are there. They're helping me, charge this plan through. To be clear, this is not the scope of work. So whenever you release like a request for proposals and you get back your proposals and they have the scope of work, this is not the scope of work. This would be after that. It's a formal document that would be included in the planning record. And it really charts out the direction of the planning process. It lays out everything from, the members of the planning team, the local planning team, their responsibilities, to how communication is going to happen during the planning process. It is the opportunity to identify ahead of time any issues or potential barriers to the planning process. Then it's also a time to, identify any external or outside plans or even tribal plans that need to be considered during the planning process. So as you can see, it includes a lot of components. So what does the planning process look like? Well, it kind of looks like this. This picture here was taken during a 3-day planning session that I facilitated for the Metlakatla Indian community. And I did this I want to be clear, I did this while I was employed under Indian Affairs. So before I started Renewal. But the folks in this photo include tribal leaders and program managers and also technical staff. And again, I think there's a couple of people from Metlakatla online today from the tribe. But you can see by the walls and the tabletops that it was an extremely productive 3 days. I think that it went really good. I've worked with this tribe for 7 years now and on a range of projects, a lot of projects. And I think that, their plans have been successful. And I think they've been successful because, they've been involved in it and they're implementing them. There's commitment from all levels, from the leadership to the staff, to managers, to the community. And it really shows. So for the next few slides, I'm going to walk you through the comprehensive planning process and the mapping project that I facilitated with Metlakatla or for Metlakatla. The participatory planning process should include a range of stakeholders, both internal and external. So internal tribal stakeholders include the folks that I've already mentioned, but can also include, need to include the community itself, and then, interns or, just a range of people. So this image here includes tribal land and resource managers, staff, there's councilman, and then a community member and a tribal intern. So, this image here was just one of many work sessions that we had with a variety of folks, but it shows, just the collaboration. Okay, so tribal youth are an example of your special population stakeholders, or what I call special population. In respect to the Metlakatla project, the tribal youth were included. It was incredibly exciting. I believe that I worked with the tribal folks that charged that through. Janelle Winter was a huge, part of that process. She was kind of champion that through. But I think that we visited, between the middle school and the high school, we visited maybe 3 or 4 times, I think 4 times. But there was an initial informational session that we held with the kids where we really, explained the planning process and kind of what that looked like for an Islands Reserve, and kind of went through that, what the purpose is. And then, started kind of asking them, what do you want for your community? And then at one point, one of the teachers approached me and asked if I would develop curriculum or some material for the students, because she wanted to do a planning project with the students for the semester. So I did. I did some 101 kind of planning materials that outlined terminology and just purpose and stuff. And at the end of the semester, her students developed PowerPoint presentations for me. And then I provided feedback. I sat and listened through I think it was a couple days of presentations, and then I provided feedback. So it was just a really good experience. I know that you can't see this, but it's a screenshot of one of the PowerPoints that I got. And this particular group, they had a vision that really promoted opportunities for exercise and eating healthy and expanding industry. They recognized that they needed to expand their industry and economy. And again, these are high school students. So, the group identified they wanted a skate park and a salad bar and a dance studio. And then they proposed that they achieve this by first getting permission from council to poll the community on what the community wants. What do they want? What kind of jobs do they want? What kind of activities do they want? And then the girls did a land use map. You can see on the bottom of the screen, there's the aerial shot that's of the island, and they circled, where they want things to be developed and where they want areas of the island to be conserved. So I think, it was just a really good experience, and those kids are now growing up, they're in college. I'm certain they're going to be sitting at the council table. They're going to be, tribal managers and staff. So it was really exciting. And then participatory planning includes engaging with the elders. So typically you have to go to them. They're sometimes reluctant to participate in the planning process for a few reasons, but once you meet them where they're at, you spend time with them, they open up and they get really excited. They're really happy to be involved in the process. So for the Mount Lacala project, we visited the senior center a few times. In one of those visits, I was lucky enough to meet this gentleman. He's since passed away, but he did leave a mark, at least in my life. He was an interesting fellow, and they had just put up this candid camera board that's behind him in this image, and he was really excited to show me what he looked like as a young man. And that's him on the left. Sorry, I got something in my eye. That's him on the left hand side with the dog. But this man also participated in general public community meetings. And I remember him being really concerned about the environment and other, I don't know, excuse me, something in my eye. I remember him being really excited about, or concerned about the environment, but then excited about, future alternative energy and recycling and other things that will help to solve some of the problems that the community was facing. So again, I think it's just really good to get folks involved, these special populations that maybe typically are kind of left out of the planning process, not intentionally, they're not intentionally left out. It's just that we don't take time to capture those populations sometimes. So I think it's important to at least be aware of those. And then in terms of special interest stakeholders, those involve, again, the school, and then they can involve, economic development boards, and they should involve any housing authority or utility authority. And then they can also involve the BIA. So the project I was in, the school was involved, the museum, the tourism folks, but also Indian Affairs, the Office of Indian Energy and Economic Development under Indian Affairs was, a huge supporter of this project, and they were a huge supporter of me in making sure that this project got through. So I think that's a good example of, folks with a trust responsibility doing, helping out, working with the tribe to make that happen, make whatever it is that the tribe wants to have happen. So I'm going to use the next few slides to go over common elements that are typically included in land use plans. In terms of land use plans, I want to point out that I feel, this is my opinion, that even if you don't have legal authority over resources that maybe you lost at some point in time, like your Aboriginal, when I'm saying resources, I mean Aboriginal or customary resources that, you've lost these authorities over time. I think, in my opinion, that there should still be a statement of value there, so a statement that shows the meaning and the importance of these resources and what they carry to the tribe. Even if you don't have legal authority over them, you can't, set, policy towards that, you can't zone whatever, but you need to at least state it, because the comprehensive land use plan is a way to exert sovereignty, and I think create a pathway for this kind of idea of legal reform at the highest levels. So the mission or a vision statement is an element that's found in land use plans. This is Nichlas, and it's way, too long for you to read. But their mission here describes this clear commitment to members and tradition, resource preservation. It really focuses on this commitment to self-sufficiency and also fostering progress while at the same time kind of honoring ancestors. And one of my favorite parts is it has this demonstrated commitment to implementing efficient and effective systems of government in order to enhance, self health and safety. So an alternative to a mission statement is a vision statement. This is a broad kind of long-term approach. You're setting out what you envision the community look like after the planning horizon. So in respect to MIC's mission statement, I have to say, I encourage the tribe to develop a vision statement instead, but they wanted a mission statement. And I think at the end of the day, I know, not think, I know I like it better. I mean, I think it's really profound. It's very effective. And I'm really glad that that's what they wanted. But I also point this out because this is an example of making sure that those that are working for you are actually working for you. Their job, my job, is to advise, provide advisory services, technical services, but at the same time, they provide you with explanation as to why they're advising one thing over another. But at the end of the day, they need to respect what you want. You drive the project. And I know, a mission versus a vision is a small thing, or may seem a small thing, but it is big. And, just make sure that you're driving that project no matter what. So quickly, I'll just go through goals are a highly generalized statement. Objectives gets that more detailed level of planning, and then the policy really lays out how things are going to happen. The land use element designates like this general distribution and location of the interrelationship. It looks at the interrelationship between uses. And GIS is incredibly valuable in doing this. Local knowledge is also a valuable source of information because it, these local knowledges really have a good idea of production systems in the environment. I mean, the folks that live there, they are the experts really on these resources because they're your resources. So these elements in this plan, or in this land use element, will relate directly to any zoning that you have in place. So the demographics section relies mostly on government databases and tribal records in order to gain this better understanding of the local population. Rational planning techniques obviously are good in this, but I want to point out that the participatory planning techniques help fill in the blanks. So especially when working with tribal nations. Census data is generalized to the population, so it estimates an entire population based on a random sample. The random sample is referred to as population in statistics, but it's hard to do this in respect to tribal nations because most tribal nations don't have this huge population. So when you take, a random sample from an already small sample, it's more likely that you're going to have a mischaracterization of that sample. So again, filling in the blanks with participatory planning, but the strong methodologies that go along with collecting and analyzing and interpreting that data is important. Now, the housing element includes age, it includes vacancy rates and costs, including mortgage and rent. It includes occupancy status, meaning, who's occupying the units. Are they, full-time residents? Are they part-time? Are they families? Are they individuals? Are they contract workers? Who is occupying those? And then it looks at the type and the value. So economic development, that component includes identification of economic development policies and strategies in coordination with that land use element. And then again, it ties back to the zoning code. So policies should reflect local and regional and statewide concerns also in order to better expand and stabilize that economic base within your local jurisdiction or within the tribal jurisdiction. So natural resources and the energy element are used to evaluate, everything from water to wildlife and watersheds and other features. It also looks at conservation and energy development. This element is used, is informed by scientific data, observational data, and local knowledge as well. So the heritage and culture element is obviously important, is an obviously important aspect of any tribal plan. It can include or should include subsistence resources, and then places of cultural significance or worship. Cemeteries are important to include in this component. And then I want to quickly point out one of the challenge areas that's been identified by the Indian Land Tenure Foundation under their organizational strategies is culture, and this trend towards cultural erosion due to loss of lands, but also this increasingly disconnect, a situation where there's this kind of disconnect between individuals and the land. So the cultural element of your plan is really the opportunity to engage the public and get folks excited again about those characteristics that make the nation unique. So the planning process and the text of the plan are a good place that are a good way to refocus efforts towards cultural preservation. The text of the plan is also a good opportunity to again state those resource values that are significant to the tribe, even those that have been lost, but the ones that you're making an effort to regain through legal reform. The services and facilities component looks at capital assets that serve the community, and these would be any infrastructure that serves that community. Open space includes any existing parks and trails. It looks at location and access and uses, and also projects for future needs. So this photo is provided by the Metlakatla Indian community. And then transportation. Transportation is included usually as its own component, and that includes modes of transportation, circulation patterns, and infrastructure. And then just last, the mapping element, which we went over. Oh, excuse me, this is not the mapping, this is a disaster mitigation. Disaster mitigation and resiliency element. This is really valuable. It's especially valuable now, given all these, extreme weather events, and then also because the new areas of funding that we have available to us to help mitigate against these threats. So, if you have this included in your plan, you're more easily able to get funding. This image here is an image that was taken from Metlakatla. It's their energy and water indicator system. So this was result of a emergency plan that I helped them to develop, and they were going through a water and emergency crisis And we kind of tabled the land use plan because of this, this imminent threat that they were experiencing. But at the end of the day, I was glad that we were able to include that disaster mitigation element into the land use plan. So it is a valuable tool to reinforce, in their case, it really reinforced what they were doing on the emergency management side. And then here we are at the mapping element. And I've already went through mapping, but again, these will be adopted both in text and in map form. So getting into adoption, a land use plan can be adopted as an advisory document or what's called a binding document. So when you adopt your plan as an advisory document, the plan simply guides development. It's a guidance on how development should occur. So in this instance, the plan must be taken into consideration when you're making land use decisions. But if there's a good reason, if there's changing conditions or whatever, those decisions, those land use decisions can deviate from the plan without having to go through this huge amendment process, unless it's like, a big deviation. But then, so alternatively, if you adopt a plan as a binding document, the decisions must follow the land use plan. So where a plan designates for land use to occur, that's where land use needs to occur. And any deviation outside of that would require an amendment of the plan under tribal law. So again, you may deviate from either. It's just the process by which you go about doing it. When the plan contains a official zoning map, the map will be simultaneously approved at the same time as the land use plan. So now in the case where you have an official zoning map that goes with your zoning code, any changes to that zoning map or zoning, any changes to the zoning map, should you add like another district, say you add say you have an existing zoning code, but it doesn't include a overlay district, but then after the planning process, you decide you want an overlay district, that would require an amendment pursuant to tribal law. Okay, so implementation, I'm not going to have time to get into, but I do want to point out that land use plans and zoning are implemented through programs, projects, and related policy. So this really involves, decision makers who guide that, decision makers who use the plan to guide their decision making, and then land and other program managers who set department priorities based on the plan, and then staff who uses the plan, carries that plan out. Like your grant staff is going to heavily rely on that plan. And then just last, this is the last thing, transformational change. So this was the last item on our roadmap. We don't fully understand the role of land use plans and policies in extraction and urbanization, meaning we don't have this large body of evidence, quantitative data that demonstrates the exact role or effect in how it shapes that environment. We know that it's a large driving factor in land change, both the plans and the policy, that they are a driving force in that, but we don't know, we can't quantitatively capture that. And we don't know it because it's hard to measure. Effectiveness is hard to measure on a large scale. And that's partly because we fail to adequately monitor plans like we should. So we don't have the data behind it that informs it. But we know that land use plans and regulations play a large role in development. That is no doubt. We know that these plans and regulations are sustained or carried out by the tribal government or the territorial government. But in this case, it's you're carrying, if you're adopting that plan, you're primarily charged with carrying that plan out, no one else. So we also know that the efficiencies and the effectiveness of that plan and of that code are subject to these external conditions. So by simply having a plan in place and a zoning code isn't enough. It really must be leveraged. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to really overcome these tribal land management issues, and the big barriers are going to persist. So, just some effective tools in that to really encourage transformational change is to promote and support good governance practice. And that includes coordination of interests, including, government to, from tribal to national, local, regional, incorporate private firms in your process, educational institutes, make sure that the public is involved in what you're doing. And then that you have a good, strong government processes and procedures in place to ensure that there is accountability. And then the second thing is just to be aware of that embeddedness. Know that it's important. Remember that you have this unique relationship, this unique government to government relationship with the federal government, but you're still entrenched, in this really kind of complex weave of political and social and cultural and natural forces that are outside of you, but they influence how your lands are used. So remember, and then the last thing that I really want to emphasize is remember that the federal government has a responsibility to respect your sovereignty and protect the tribe's membership and support those programs, tribal and social and natural resource programs. So try to leverage your unique authorities to the fullest extent possible to use those programs and make connections between resources, bridge these connections so you can make sure that your plans and your policy are reinforced by those external forces rather than, working against you. So thank you very much. That was a long one for those of you who are still with me.
Thank you, Amy. In fact, most of us are still with you, it looks like.
Are you? I can't get you guys on my screen.
Well done.
Good.
Certainly, please join with me in thanking Amy for her presentation today. Very thorough, very good information for sure. Amy's contact information is found on these slides. We'll make sure that you can get a copy of that presentation as well. So that way you can browse it. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to Amy and communicate directly with her. In the meantime, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot them in the chat or raise your hand, and I could unmute you for a moment to ask the question through audio.
May I quickly introduce Janelle Winter from the tribe, just that she's on here. There she is. She's with Metlakatla Indian Community, by the way. I just want to point that out. She is.
We support this entire project. It was a true example of participatory planning. We've had other planning experiences that have not been as beneficial. And so working with Renewal on the land use project and other things has been incredibly beneficial and helped us to understand that planning process so much better.
Thank you. Yeah, I certainly, if you're going to see Amy again if you come to our conference in April. The Tribal Land Staff National Conference will be at Mystic Lake, April 5th through 7th. Amy will be presenting at our conference IRL in real life. So, hopefully, and you could talk with her directly as well during those moments. If there aren't any questions, certainly like to encourage everyone to fill out the evaluation that you'll receive over the next few days about this session, but also register for January's webinar, which I'm going to put back in the chat. Yep, there it is, which will be continuing our planning conversation about planning and about how to make the budgets work. So please do take a few minutes to register there. Thanks again to Amy for her presentation. We are certainly grateful that you share your expertise with Indian country. And yes, to the question in chat, the slides from the presentation will be available to those who registered as well. So you'll get a copy of those. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and if you want to, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me too. Thank you.
Thank you.